Welcome to the show, everyone. Today, I am absolutely honored to have Representative Thomas Massie on the show. He is Congressman who is fighting for all of our rights, fighting for privacy. Welcome to the show, Congressman Massie.
Hey, thank you, Naomi, for having me on.
So I brought you on the show today because recently there was a bill passed and you voted against it. And it was basically the implementation of what you described as a Cyber Czar, which doesn't sound promising. The exact name is the National Cyber Data Act. And I wanted to talk about what this entails. This was passed, even though you opposed it. Like, what is this going to do for privacy on the internet, for our civil liberties? So let's jump straight into it. And could you just give us a basic overview of this position and what they're hoping to achieve through this position?
Yeah, let me tell you where we are legislatively in the process so people can assess the threat level here. I would put it at very high. The threat level is very high of this becoming a reality. So in last year, or a couple of years ago in the NDAA, they set up a committee to study whether they needed a position like this and how to best coordinate U.S. cyber policy. And so this committee decided that we needed the Cyber Czar position, and not just a temporary Cyber Czar that like a president might hire to sort of coordinate things for his administration, but a permanent position. Now, they knew it would be a lot of trouble to set up a whole new department, like a new Department of Homeland Security, right? So instead they say, oh, we're just creating a position, a single position, but this position can hire 75 people and have 2 deputy assistants. Wow. And so that was their recommendation. So there was a bill introduced based on their recommendation. And week before last or last week, this thing pops up on my radar and we're having a hearing on it in the Oversight Committee. And I literally almost just like walk into this hearing and I'm like, what the hell is this thing? And I start digging into it. I'm like, this is not good. And I started talking to some other Republicans on the committee. And I'm like, is the White House for this? I mean, it's basically to expand the deep state, okay? And I said, is the White House for this? And they're like, no, the White House is against it. They've sent a letter. They don't want this. And they said, well, where are we as Republicans on the Oversight Committee? And nobody knew if they were for it or against it. And so what I discovered is basically every Republican on the committee just sort of rolled over and became for this position, to create this position. So we had a hearing on this bill, okay, that had been introduced. But, you know, in the times of COVID, no like small bills are getting passed. And my suspicion was if we report this out of the Oversight Committee, and by the way, there are 3 other committees that have jurisdiction on this bill, but none of them had a hearing on it. Like they picked the least conspicuous committee to have a hearing on creating a new director within the White House.
It's so unlike the government to try to just slide sneaky things through that is going to drastically change how we live our lives. And so this is currently, you had the hearing on it, it's passed. Where do we stand now with all of this?
Yeah, so they passed it out of the committee. And then this is what I suspected would happen. The next week, they stuck it in the National Defense Authorization Act, which is a bill that's like hundreds of pages long. And ostensibly has to deal with the military, the national defense. But they stuck this bill in there and they passed it. And literally, I was the only one out of 435 members who went to the floor and spoke against it. And they gave me a whopping like 45 seconds to speak against this amendment, which was it was a standalone bill, but they stuck it in there. So now the National Defense Authorization Act passed Congress. So this went from like 0 to a House bill in 2 weeks. It's now going to be conferenced with the Senate. The Senate National Defense Authorization Act also has similar legislation. Their legislation doesn't go as far. The House legislation would just go ahead and establish this position with 2 assistant directors and 75 full-time equivalent reports. The Senate version would say, well, let's study it and then maybe create the position. And so that's where we are. We won't know what we've got until the House and the Senate go to conference and then report a National Defense Authorization Act out of that conference. So I just wanted to give you sort of where we are in the sausage process, making process, before we go into what this bill does and what the director would do.
It's absolutely shocking that something so drastic can just kind of zip through so easily. And it makes us aware of how this process works. I mean, I think we have this misconception in our heads about how a bill is made, and it goes you through all of this like checks and balances, and we make sure it's okay. But the reality is they sneak these things through. Nobody reads about it. Nobody knows where they stand, and they just kind of go along with it. And you mentioned that the president is against it. And I believe that a similar position used to exist. It was called the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator, and Obama created that in 2009. This was eliminated in 2018, and apparently this new position is going to basically be akin to a position that was just eliminated, which seems all very strange to me. So talk me through what this position would mean, what this person would do.
So I've said that if Democrats are in the White House, the director will be a Google lobbyist, and if Republicans are in the White House, the director will be an Intel lobbyist. So basically, because you think this person will interface with OMB, the Office of the Management and Budget, and have veto authority over spending, okay, at the White House, and they will be responsible for sort of picking, I would say, standards and what are the best practices, and how people should conduct their hygienic cyber activities within the government, but also they'll implement CISA and make sure that's the bill that passed a few years ago here in Congress to facilitate sharing between industry and the government. So anyways, this person ostensibly will also be on the National Security Council and can convene meetings and compel other people in the government to show up. And by the way, the 75 direct reports, those 75 people will remain employed regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, and they will be the same 75 people. So this is like the deep state. They got to win in the Obama administration when he set up that position, but because it wasn't legislatively codified, when Trump got elected, he eliminated that position. What they're trying to do is create a flywheel within the government that keeps spinning regardless of what happens in the election.
What could this do to change the face of the internet?
It's all in the name of security, okay? So I guess they're representing all of our interests, but I can tell you the lobbyists are going to spend a lot of time talking to this person. So the person will probably arbitrate between what kind of standards and what kind of software and third-party off-the-shelf stuff is being used by the federal government to maintain cyber security. Ostensibly, it's for cyber security, but here's another thing, Naomi, that troubles me a little bit. Right now, a lot of these functions are within Air Force Cyber Command and NSA, and these are military postures, right? We're looking out for foreign threats. Well, now they're kind of moving that function a little bit toward the domestic side, in my opinion, and making it more inwardly focused by saying that we're going to have somebody in the White House who's coordinating this rather than somebody in the military who's coordinating our cyber defense. And that's because it's not so much a defense, I think, as it will be an inward focus. So that concerns me a little bit. And there's another sort of concern that I have based on the sort of architecture of this. We are, there's no doubt that everybody in the military eventually reports to the commander-in-chief, and that's the president, who is elected every 4 years. There's no doubt about that, and he could fire anybody, any of the generals, or move them around or do whatever. But this cyber director, I'm afraid, will be more like an FBI director, where they will say, oh, this is a nonpartisan person, And really, the president shouldn't seek to replace him when he comes in. And if the president does, then it looks like the president's trying to do something nefarious, because here's this nice little cyber director who's apolitical, never had a political thought in his head, has no agenda, doesn't seek to enrich himself as a lobbyist afterwards, even though he might have before. And so why would the president want to replace this person? So I'm also worried that any move toward the cyber director by an elected official will look like an elected official is trying to undo something for their own purposes. It's just more inertia in the federal government. It's more bureaucracy. And I think it's really driven by industry in large part.
Yeah. And so they're talking about this in terms of national security. All the rhetoric that I've read has sort of been hinting at this impending cyber attack. One day we're going to be attacked and we need to be able to defend ourselves. So let's set up this committee and we'll protect ourselves and figure out what's in our nation's best interest. Now, I always take pause when they mention the nation, because they usually mean the nation state, not the individuals within said nation. So it's all usually about, protecting power, etc. And so it really worries me that they're using this rhetoric and passing it off as, well, we're doing this for the good of the people. And it seems very contradictory if you take into account the other bills that are currently in Congress also, including the Earn It bill and the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act. Both of those are trying to effectively ban end-to-end encryption. And this would weaken the security of every citizen in America. So it seems very incongruous that they're on the one hand saying, well, we need this extra committee, this extra cyber czar to protect us all. Meanwhile, we're stripping away these protections that you already have as individuals. So are these two bills at odds with each other? Are they going to be symbiotic and it's all just going to be a complete disaster for individual privacy?
Before I answer that directly, your question reminded me of something else that came up in our hearing, which was, they said, poor Sony got hacked and they lost some movies, somebody infiltrated their systems. And so one of my questions in the hearing is, to what degree should the American taxpayer be responsible for protecting the data of a Japanese company that does 8 trillion yen in revenue every year, right? Like, why did that now become the job of the U.S. taxpayer to protect a company with $8 trillion, 8 trillion yen of revenue? They would be better served, to your point, if we didn't outlaw encryption or if we didn't enforce backdoors. In fact, I think that's what the cyber director is going to do. They're tasked with developing policy. Like the 75 people that are going to work there, they're not going to be like hackers or brilliant, like MIT technologists. They're going to be like political scientists, okay? By the way, I'm a political science denier. It's not a science, okay? There are sciences, but not political science. But I think there will be some political scientists there, and then who are developing policy, and they're going to mandate these backdoors, like the bills that you're talking about that they're trying to get passed, okay, to outlaw encryption or to mandate backdoors. Who's going to implement that? Somebody's got to make sure it all gets done, right? And so I think that's probably what this cyber director position is for, is to make sure that stuff gets done, because one of the bills that passed previously was called CISA, C-I-S-A, which was to make sure that industry and the government were sharing information. And that's one of the tasks of this cyber director. So I think when they do eventually pass laws to try to outlaw encryption, which, by the way, is a ridiculous notion. It's like trying to outlaw math. I mean, that's what encryption is. You're just running mathematical functions over your data, and then somebody has to run the inverse of that to extract the data. They're trying to ban math. But in any case, if and when they do pass those bills, I think this cyber director is the person who's going to be responsible for making sure those bills are implemented across all of the agencies.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned outlawing math, because Australia not too long ago actually passed a bill that already effectively does what the US is trying to do. It's basically akin to the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data Act, where they've made it so that companies have to provide data. If they can't, then there are millions of dollars in fines that the company would be liable for. And so it necessitates backdoors, et cetera. And I believe that the Prime Minister said something akin to, "We are a nation of laws, not mathematics," or something stupid, where he literally, I mean, and there were all these articles that came out of it saying like the Australian Prime Minister doesn't believe in math. Like what's going on there? But it just, I mean, you basically set up this scenario that seems like it's going to be this circus of a bunch of bureaucrats dictating policy about highly technical things that they don't seem to get a grasp of. Like, I've listened to these hearings, and thank you so much for all your pushback in them. Your questions about civil liberties and privacy have been fantastic. But it just seems that, you know, they're answering these questions and saying, well, I don't know how they're going to do it, but we just say it has to be secure for the individual and also give a backdoor to government. And they just don't seem to recognize that, you know, people in power are made from the same matter as everyone else. There are some bad people in power too, you know, just like there are bad people in society. Who's going to protect us from the people who have access to the back doors? These corruptible people, these fallible people, just like the rest of us. There seems to be this cognitive dissonance when they're not quite thinking through the consequences of this. So what are the consequences you foresee? Like, how is this going to change an individual's privacy on the internet? And should we be worried?
You should be worried. I was worried in the hearing. That's why I asked how much thought was given toward civil liberties in this position. I suggested if they're going to have deputy, you know, directors of cyber, that one of the deputy directors should be deputy director in charge of civil liberties, that there needs to be an advocate there. Now, I know they would probably just put a placeholder there and tell them to be quiet and mind their own business, but at least they could make an effort to try and show that there's some balance within this organization, because the word security is mentioned many times in this legislation. And anytime people use the word security, we have to understand there's going to be a balance between security and privacy and civil liberties. And if all 75 of these people, plus the director and the 2 deputy directors, are all about security, and they don't think about civil liberties, then it's just designed to infringe on your civil liberties. So I think you should be worried about it. It just didn't get enough attention. That's why they rushed this stuff through. There was no opportunity to amend this legislation. Typically in a committee, you have the hearing and then you have a markup. And the markup is where any member of the committee can offer amendments to improve the bill. And then everything is guaranteed to get a vote in a committee. On the floor of the House, they can shut down the process. But in committee, there is some glimpse of a legislative process in a committee. Well, we didn't have a markup on this bill. Nobody was allowed to offer amendments. I ran through my head of some of the amendments I would offer, like requiring them to have some civil liberties advocate there, but I never got to offer the amendments. And then when it went to the floor, it was part of a larger bill for which we were not allowed to offer amendments. So right now, this is, the House has passed a National Defense Authorization Act. The Senate has passed one. The final language hasn't been determined. People could call their congressman. It's sort of like grabbing a freight train, you know, while you're wearing sneakers and just like trying to stop it. But it's still worth doing. And everybody has 2 senators and 1 U.S. representative. I'm kind of on a mission to try and tell people how to effectively advocate with their congressmen, regardless of what the legislation is and regardless of what their political stripes are. I say don't bother writing letters, don't send emails, pick up the phone and call. Don't like comment on a tweet or put a Facebook comment. That's not enough. But if you pick up the phone and call a congressional office, a real person answers it, not a robot. And we don't have as many real people here as you think. Like if like you and a bunch of your buddies called all in the same day, like even 10 phone calls would be enough to like really get the attention of a congressional office. So that's what I would do. I don't know. I'm just sort of like, sorry, Naomi, I'm kind of like, man, this thing just ran right through here. And I tried everything I could just to raise awareness of it. without slowing it down, frankly.
No, it's terrifying. And it's also terrifying that out of everyone, you were the only one to push back against this. And it makes me wonder if the problem does lie with individuals speaking up. I've been encouraging everyone to write. I will not do that anymore. I will tell people to pick up the phone. I think people should be pushing back against the Earn It bill, the Lawful Access to Encrypted Data bill, to the National Cyber Director Act.
I would tell them what you don't approve of, which is this establishment of a permanent cyber czar. They'll stick stuff on a big important bill like the NDAA because they think it's the best way to get their legislation passed. But as soon as that little rider becomes a liability to the bigger bill, right? This bill authorizes over $700 billion of spending, okay? And if the folks here got the impression that this little tick that's attached to their $700 billion bill was jeopardizing their bill, then they would probably try to jettison it or go with the weaker version of the language, which is to study whether to establish the cyber position. Maybe you just go all out and say, vote against the NDAA because it's got this bad provision in it. And then that may encourage them to try to get rid of the provision because they really don't want to jeopardize $700 billion of spending. They don't want to give any of the horses an excuse to get out of the barn. Like, they hate to even lose 10 votes on a bill like this. They want it to be so unanimous. You can have an influence. By the way, writing a letter is still effective, but what happens with letters is they can be responded to with a form letter, and they typically are. Whereas if it's a phone call, you have to deal with it like right there, then and there, and it's like taking bandwidth. Like 20 phone calls is a lot more work to respond to than 20 letters if they're all on the same topic. And so that's just as somebody here, like I've got a curtain here, I'm behind the curtain.
We're peeking behind the curtain to see what really happens in these congressional offices. You
can't handle the truth. I'm not going to show you what's behind this curtain, but I'll tell you how to change it.
That's wonderful. Well, I really appreciate your time and your advice. I really do see the slippery slope that we're going down in terms of cyber privacy. At the moment, it really does seem to be tipping the power away from the individual and towards bureaucrats, overseers, these cyber czars that you talk about. I think that it's more important than ever that people are speaking out about this and pushing back, because it just seems like a very dangerous world where we're living more and more of our lives on the internet, and yet our privacy is rapidly deteriorating there. So I just think it's so important to push back. So any final words on this or calls to action?
Yeah, just final words. We don't need to set up 75 bureaucrats who are going to control your life and create a permanent annuity for their existence. People in Congress should be deciding what the laws and the regulations should be. Like, if we had decided in the bill to hire 75 more experts in Congress that are reportable to an elected official who's on the ballot every 2 years, I would have been more receptive to that. These aren't 75 people that are going to report to that president. They've just got to outlast whoever their boss is, right? There'll be a few go-betweens between them and the president, whoever that might be. And they just got to outlast them. They're going to burrow in like chiggers, and it won't matter who you vote for. You're going to get the same result. And that's what really reflexively, I think, hopefully people will reject, is the notion that we're going to grow a bureaucracy and that people who are not elected are going to be responsible for basically reading your emails or deciding, who gets to read your emails. And they do have this notion that your privacy hasn't been violated as long as only those 75 people know what's, in your emails. And people are maybe watching this and saying, oh, he's overreacting. They're not going to be reading your emails, blah, blah, blah. No, it's probably going to be much worse than that. Like, they don't have time to read your emails. They're going to be looking at large swaths of data, all under the auspices of keeping you safe and keeping our elections safe. We just don't need more bureaucrats, because once you establish this, it will never go away.
Yeah, it's terrifying, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and also the work you're doing to highlight how the majority of our laws are actually created by unelected bureaucrats that are not voted into office. They're people who are put in a position, they're given a blank check to say you can write whatever laws you want and set whatever, precedents and guidelines you want. People have to follow them, and people don't realize that this is a very dangerous thing that's happening at the moment, and we should be pushing back. But thank you so much for your time, Congressman Massie. I really appreciate it, and keep fighting for privacy and individual rights.
Thank you, Naomi, for having me on to talk about this when nobody else is.
Thank you so much. I've added a link to the description below to help you find the contact details of your representative so that you can reach out and let them know that you are not in favor of them banning end-to-end encryption or setting up a Cyber Czar. If you'd like to help me make more videos like this, then consider purchasing something from my store. I have some awesome swag in there designed by some of my favorite artists. And today, the contents of my mug are proudly brought to you by this anonymous person on Cointree. If you'd like to leave me a message on my Cointree page, head to cointr.ee/Naomi Brockwell. Thank you for watching this video and for hitting the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Whoa! This was a disaster. Cheers. I'm puppy sitting again. This is Maisie, and she's gorgeous. Maisie says, reach out to your representatives.